thank you, Dr. Phyllis Thompson, for that very generous introduction. You'll see that most of it has to do with the theater aspect, and I'll get to how art comes into that in a bit. I also want to thank the Reese Museum and particularly Spencer Brenner, but also Randy Sanders for making this exhibit possible. And then, and I also want to thank all the students that helped make this possible. We had students in our German program helping with translations. We had an intern working with Spencer to make this all possible. And we also had different faculty engaged students. Kara Harker is engaging one of her dance students to create a dance. And so it's really exciting to not just see beautiful artwork on walls, but also to see young people become really engaged with the material. So I'm going to begin with just a comment about the title of my talk, because I realize that it makes it sound like I'm going to give you a bunch of quotes from Claire-Lise Holy and her reflections on theater and art. And that is not what I'm doing here. She didn't really speak about her work very often, but rather what I'd like us to think about is how her artwork is reflecting on her work in theater and also her connections with literature. And so it's a little bit, I thought it was a sexy title, but it didn't really convey what I was after. So I'd like to begin by just sharing my first encounter with Claire-Lise Holy, and because my connections to her are not just academic, they're also personal. So Claire-Lise was a remarkable woman who I knew as a child already. She is my aunt. That's just a disclaimer. But the way I first became aware of her as a child, as an artist, was through this particular drawing that hangs in my parents' apartment. No matter where we move, it's always in their bedroom. And there was something about this drawing that haunted me. I've worked through it many times thinking about what is it about that drawing that haunts me. The drawing is actually a sectioned piece from a set design that she created for a poet and philosopher by the name of Gottfried Benn. And it was for her television studio work, and then she did these sort of individual drawings. And one of the things that you'll see, and we'll talk about a little bit later, is that the person sitting on the bed is completely in white, so no color, whereas everything else is colorful. So I think there's something about that aesthetic that spoke to me. I also remember times where Claire-Lise would come to visit us in the United States. She was living in Germany at the time, working for the German television studio. They're one of the studios there. And she would be doing research on work. She was engaged with doing a TV film on Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill and their time in America. So she came to visit us and then took photographs of masonry so that they could redesign the set to look like a New York set, and just these kinds of things. So I was aware of her as a child and as a young woman already as someone who's working in this area, but we didn't really talk about it. What I did discover later was that there are similarities between these works that haunt me and the works of Samuel Beckett. And Samuel Beckett's works also have these sort of gray, figureless old men sitting on beds in a lot of them. And you'll see some of those images. And this made me think a lot about, more recently, is why are we drawn to certain aesthetics? I don't know if we can really answer that. And why are certain artists drawn to aesthetics? So we have these two artists that are doing something very similar, and in fact, three artists that are doing something very similar, and they're not always in communication with each other. It's not about influence. I'm not talking about influence. I'm talking about somehow ideas that are in the air, perhaps. And I wanted to find a way to incorporate these different aesthetics that haunt me. And I knew at one point that I'd have to write about it. And so this is the cover of Samuel Beckett in Contemporary Art, There's one chapter in it that's on Claire-Lise Holy and Samuel Beckett. So what I'll be talking about is Claire-Lise Holy, and this is not a hierarchical thing. This is just that they all three fit on the slide this way. Samuel Beckett, where you can see Samuel Beckett, that's an image of him working in a German television studio, and then Dieter Leisegang. Dieter Leisegang was a poet and philosopher who also did the miniatures that you see in the gallery, and he was married to Claire-Lise's husband. No, I'm sorry. She was married to Dieter's brother. Sorry. So I'm gonna backtrack just a little bit to give you sort of an overview of her biography. So Holy was born in Saarbrücken, Germany in 1938 to a Swiss family. From 1956 to 1961, she studied art in Geneva, Switzerland. And then she studied also at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich, Germany, and later at the art school in Wiesbaden, Germany, where she met her husband, or who would become her husband, the artist Joachim Leisegang. So from 1961 until her retirement in 2000, she worked as a stage and so a set and costume designer for the German radio and television stations, the Allgemeine Rundfunkanstaltung Germany, and its subsidiary broadcasting system, Hessischer Rundfunk. During that time and for those stations, she was involved in several international engagements for television and film production, as well as opera and theater. So this television company, broadcasting system often also filmed theater productions. So Holy's skill and creative spirit directly resulted in the types of assignments she was handed. She was handed a lot of assignments that had to deal with contemporary artists and philosophers, and because of this skill. And in the back, there's a book of her costume and set designs that were displayed a few years ago in Germany. So one of the things that often gets asked is, did she study costume and art design? She did not technically study to be a designer, right? She studied art, but she was always very interested in design. So one of the few stories that I know of that she talked about was when she was 14, her father took her to Geneva to buy a winter coat. But she wanted to learn how to sew, and she actually wanted the material to make her own coat, but he wouldn't buy it. And so she literally undid the seams of this expensive coat and created her own to create a pattern. And her father was horrified. But then she sewed the coat back together. But, it was this sort of, if nobody's going to teach me how to do this, I'm going to teach myself how to do this. And so that was one of the things that she did. Some of you will know that I have several pieces of her clothing, including this jacket that she created or recreated. So another interesting thing is that Beckett is working with the German television broadcasting system, the Süddeutscher Rundfunk, which is not in Wiesbaden or Frankfurt, it's in Stuttgart, but it is also a very popular, broadcasting system at the time. And he was invited about 1963-64 to produce a play for television. And he ended up working with the Süddeutscher Rundfunk from 1964 about till 1982, where he wrote television plays that he then also directed and filmed. So they're both working in the same media at the same time. Beckett is also from about 1970 working for the German working for the German stage in Berlin at the Schiller Werkstatt. And so again, these two creative minds are working in the same environment. They're not necessarily reading or seeing each other's work right away. So while the two never meet, they're working in the same place, in the same medium. And then what we get is, this is just a close picture of Beckett. And so what I want us to do now is to look at her work with Beckett and some of that aesthetic as how she's reflecting on and working in theater and seeing where their aesthetics combine or are similar, right? One of her major assignments was in 1989 to 1990, where she was asked to create the set and costuming for an opera called Neither. Now, most of you will never have heard of Neither. It's a very short opera. This is the libretto. Beckett wrote the libretto, even though he claimed to hate opera, and the experimental composer, Morton Feldman, did the music. This was done about 1976, but Germany had its premiere production in 1990, which was for the broadcasting system that Claire-Lise was working with, and she was assigned to do this. You can see the text. I'll just read it. To and fro in shadow, from inner to outer shadow, from impenetrable self to impenetrable unself by way of neither, as between two lit refuges whose doors once neared gently close, once turned away from gently part again, beckoned back and forth and turned away, heedless of the way, intent on the one gleam or the other, unheard footfalls only sound, till at last halt for good, absent for good, from self to other, then no sound, then gently light unfading on that unheeded neither, unspeakable home. So I came across this production not because Claire-Lise told me she ever did this. I was working on my PhD from 1999 to 2002, and I would visit her and I would go on and on and on about my dissertation, and she would nod, never having it. She'd like, yeah, I read some of his stuff once, never having told me that she designed this very famous production. And then years later, I was doing some research on Beckett and Germany. And I came across an article by Katherine Weiss, who is a musicologist, who wrote about this production. And I'm like, oh. And unfortunately, Claire-Lise was no longer alive, so I couldn't really ask her about it. But what I want us to think about is how this production actually speaks to both that libretto. So that libretto is hard. Some people would just call it a poem, but it is sung. And how it speaks to it and how it actually also connects with other famous productions that she probably knew of or knew of the production workbooks that led other productions to have a similar aesthetic. So one thing you'll see is this is a famous Beckett play. This is his last play, actually, What, Where. If you can see, there are these drab costumes, right? Gowns. That's specified by Beckett, long drab gowns or long gray gowns. If we think about, this is the soprano, Sarah Leonard, she's wearing a similar kind of dress. It almost doesn't look like something that was created for that production, but it was created for that production. It's just a sort of very simple dress. Holy thought it would be very important that since the figure in this opera stands practically stark still and is singing this very difficult, challenging piece of music, that she had to be comfortable, but she also wanted it to align with Beckett's aesthetic, right? What Beckett was after. This is Beckett's Quadrat production that he wrote and directed for the German television studio in the 90s. And again, you can see these just sort of very drab costumes. Very different from Waiting for Godot, right? Beckett's late work is very different from Waiting for Godot. And so we get this sort of sense of that kind of costuming that she's looking for, these gray colors. You'll also notice in the sets that even though this is a black and white photo, in a lot of Beckett's sets, the colors, it almost looks like a black and white photo. And we also get that in this. There are shades of like dark green and purple in it, but it's meant to look like shades of gray, which is a term that Beckett uses a lot, shades of gray. And so that's an interesting element to this, is how she's looking at Beckett in terms of those shades of gray, how she's trying to simulate an aesthetic that he would appreciate, with at the same time not just replicating things, right? I also want us to think about in a production of Waiting for Godot, there's always the famous moon, right? That often doesn't look realistic. It comes up, and it often sort of is just that sort of pinpoint light. And in Beckett's first productions, he actually just used like a light bulb, like behind a screen, to make that round look. And we get that with the clock, right? So she's drawing on these other productions she knows. We get that on the clock that is fixated there. And this I find fascinating. So this is a production after Claire-Lise Holy's. I don't know if the designer was influenced by Holy or what, but what we get often in Beckett, and if you think about the libretto, about the walls of the refuge that are not quite held up. And so you get this motion of walls going outward. And so in Endgame, we have that here in this production, but we also have that in this production, neither, right? So we have these sort of walls that are going outward as if they're going to collapse. And so that's another sort of interesting similarity that we see. This is A-Joe. This is from Beckett's own production that he designed and wrote and directed for German television. Again, we have the shades of gray. And I want us to notice here is those 3 different sized kind of curtain things. Those are like windows or doors. And the character goes and he peers out of each one, and it falls. And we have that also in this, right, with the doors going to the doors. And you'll see this in these drawings as well, which we'll look at, is that windowed effect, right? So here it's a door leading into a door, leading into a door. And then at the way end, you have the soprano's disembodied head, which you get disembodied body parts in Beckett too. So it's these interesting layers that we're seeing in the work. And I want this to be a little bit interactive, this talk. So I'm interested in hearing what kinds of things that you all are seeing that are echoed in these works. So at the Q&A, we can maybe talk some more about like what are other elements we see. So Claire-Lise doesn't then just stop with her design, obviously. She does her design for television. She's done many ones for other playwrights, but the only Beckett one she's done is Neither. But she also has done this whole series, the series that we have here in accompaniment, but also other works like Metamorphosis, where we have characters who are looking at either a mirror or a window, and that peers into this other world, but not quite so. And so, and I find this particularly interesting, this one, Metamorphosis. The thing that you see in the chair that some of you might be able to see is a spider. So it's as if she's reflected by a spider, but we also have this modern gray world reflected, which is obviously behind her because it's a mirror, but she's somehow in this other world. So there's this interesting sort of echoing there. And that image is very much connected to Rockaby, which is actually written in the 70s. It's written about 1974, but this is the BBC version of it from 1982 of a woman in a rocking chair. And in the text in Rockaby, we don't see this, but in the text, she's looking out, we hear her thinking, looking out a window, looking for someone like herself, right? We hear that echo through, and in the end, she goes into the basement to be alone. So there's these interesting sort of connections there. And again, something like this, which is called antique. You have an old lady sitting in front of the antique window, and this is actually one drawing, but as if two panels. And what you'll see here is she's here. You kind of see the reflection of her bun. It's probably the same woman from the other drawing. In the second panel, she's in the window. She's become one of the marbled statues. So Claire-Lise Holy is also dealing with this thing about like what happens, how we become petrified in a sense, right? Petrified as in turned to stone, as well as frightened maybe. And that's where we get these like figures, these particularly elderly individuals who become white. So if you think of that first slide I showed with the old man on the bed where he's completely white. And in Beckett, we get this kind of idea of whitening as well. A very short play called Catastrophe, where a director and an assistant director are shaping a protagonist who's on a pedestal. They talk about whitening his flesh to make him look more like a corpse, right? So there's something going on there. These are two productions. I had to throw these in. I directed these. The Department of Theater and Dance graciously let me direct these many years ago. But what I wanted to show with them is the ways in which Beckett has these female solitary figures, often sitting, often in stillness, and how connected that is to Holy's aesthetic as well. And Footfalls, I think, is also an example of that. And you'll also see that grayness of the dress and stuff. So I want to move us to the other. So those were her images reflecting on theater and dramatic work. And I would say reflecting on it in a way in which she's borrowing, but not under the sense of influence. Rather, if she's creating something for the stage, she needs to know the work of the playwright and his texts to try to recreate that. But then also, she takes what she learns in that process and ends up creating her own visual art, her own sort of work apart from her work in television and theater, and that stuff hasn't left her. So maybe she too is haunted by certain types of images, right? So Dita Leisegang is related to Holy in that he is her brother-in-law. He's married. She's married to his brother, right? I'm going to make that mistake for the rest of my life now. And they knew each other for only about 14 years, right? She meets him about 1969, and he dies, 1959, and he dies in 73. So there's only like 14 years that they are together. One of the things that she does late in her life is she creates this whole series of drawings that reimagines Dita looking out of a window and what could possibly have been in his mind. He was a poet. He was a philosopher. He did little miniatures. They had their little artist community where they talked about stuff. But then she's sort of reimagining that late in her life. And what's happened late in her life that gets her to reimagine that is she gets a degenerate illness. She gets a form of MS late in her life where it becomes increasingly more and more difficult for her to hold a pencil, right? She belonged to an organization like our Final Exit organization, and in 2009, when she could no longer draw at all, she could no longer control her hands, she decided to end her own life. Dieter died in 1973 by also taking his own life. So he was very unhappy. Maybe that's an understatement at the time. But for many years, all of his poetic life, and you can see this in his poems, there's this sort of movement towards death anyway. There's this movement towards not having any more words to say. And in fact, one of his collections that's published right after his death, Lauter letzte Worte, means like always last words, or like words running out, this sort of thing. And so his whole thing is, when I have nothing else to write, I don't exist anymore. And so in 1973, he takes his own life. That's an image of him and his son, Christian. And Chris lives in Los Angeles. Their collaboration begins many years before this, before she goes back sort of intellectually, spiritually, before she goes back to that time and reimagines him. They're already working together. In 1968, she provides 6 drawings for his book of poetry called Hoffmann am Fenster. And this is important because those of you who study German or will know the writer E.T.A. Hoffmann. He wrote a short story called The Sandman, and it is the short story where we get the expression rose-colored glasses, right? If somebody's looking at something with rose-colored glasses, they're looking at it better than it is, so they're imagining it better than it is. Well, the protagonist in the short story buys some rose-colored glasses from some shady scientist. He looks out his window and he sees this woman in this other apartment building across the way, and he imagines her as this perfect woman. But everybody else knows that she's an automaton, she's a robot. He doesn't see it, he sees all the fluid motions. And this story, it ends up with him jumping out of a window because he's gone crazy. So that's a really super truncated version of it. You have to read it, it's fantastic, there's English translations. But Dieter wrote a poem and put it in a collection of poems called Hoffmann am Fenster. So Hoffmann, E.T.A. Hoffmann, at the window, right? And the window is a very, very important trope in German literature and German art. This drawing is very different. If anybody wants to see the book, I do have it with me. Is very different than the works that you see here. They're not with color, they're sort of sketches, but they're already collaborating, they're already thinking about working together. Or they are already working together. So for Leisegang, there were he's using the window motif in his own writing, and he writes about how he's using this motif. So he says, and I would say that this kind of philosophy, or this kind of way in which he's interpreting his works, also works for Beckett. The Fenster Auge motif is the window eye motif, right? So you're looking out of a window, but your eyes are also windows, and just all these kinds of layers that you can think. The Erinnerungsmotif, so he says his poems include all 3 of these, is the remembrance motif. So that is that you're remembering. And in a sense, in his poems, you get this like interesting dialogue where characters looking out a window and it brings back a past memory, right? So looking forward, but looking back. And these drawings do that in a way. And then the one that's very difficult, the Motiv der Selbstaufhebung im Irgendwie, Irgendwo, Irgendwann im Refugium. I have tried to translate the best I could. It's the self-preservation motif. And the self-preservation motif comes through a somehow, somewhere, sometime towards a refuge. So Beckett's always working with these ideas of refuges, and refuges that don't really kind of exist, like a refuge without a roof, comes up in many of his short stories. And in Leisegang's poems, you get this element as well. So a refuge that is it really a refuge? Is it really a self-preservation? What do you need to self-preserve yourself and things like that? And we get the windows in this as well. Like this is from Lauter letzte Worte. The notes are Joachim Leisegang's notes. He gave me this copy where he corrected some things in the actual printing and put down some information. But the miniature is Leisegang's miniature, is Dieter Leisegang's miniature. And what is interesting here, I think, is that you see a woman looking in a mirror, which is a kind of window, but we're looking over her shoulder. So we're seeing her reflection, but we kind of see her elbow. And it is striking to that. So he does that drawing, think about the 60s, late 60s, and she and Claire-Lise Holy does this other one where we have this woman many years later, right? And the hair is similar, right? It's like the putting up your hair in a bun. So I just think this is a sort of interesting connection between these two artists. Dita also has many little miniatures where you have just a chair in front of a window. So I take this as the onlooker, am about to go and sit in that chair, right? Like I'm approaching that chair, I'm seeing the chair from behind. And so we get to the current exhibit where you have the figure of Dita, and we're seeing past his shoulder looking out to a window, which is obviously not a real window because it's kind of off kilter, and it's kind of like sometimes we look into a hallway, sometimes we look into just some kind of strange abstraction. So there's different things that we're seeing. So it's not that he's looking out and we see what he sees with his eye, but it's this sort of the mind's eye, the recreation through the mind's eye. And connected to that, I thought I'd just give like 3 lines of one of the poems of Dita, and this is from Dita. This is one that was discovered right after he had passed away in his papers. The dates on these poems are Dita Leisegang's dates. He dated all of his work, and he wanted them to be reproduced with the date, like the date is part of the actual poem. And so he writes this really perhaps weeks, perhaps days before he passes away, before he takes his own life. His father had died the year before. And so Vergangenheiten means the pasts, right? We don't really have a good word for that in English. It's like your pasts, plural, not your past. Vergangenheit is the singular, Vergangenheiten is the plural. So German, he's actually putting a plural on this. The last 3 lines are meinem Vater und mir, die vergangen sind vor lauter Tod. So my father and me, this having passed through lots of through constant deaths. Da öffne ich mein Fenster und sag's in der Nacht hinaus. I open my window and say into the night, and the poem is over. 1973, right? So what is said? Is it silence that is said into the night? Is it something that he can express that said into the night? Is it something that can only be expressed through a visual and not words? Like, we don't know. And we don't know if the poem's not finished, though he has other poems that he concludes with something that is not a period. A lot of times he has no punctuation. Sometimes he does have like a colon or something else. So I think it's probably deliberate. So it's also very similar to, there's another poet who has something about yelling into the night, something about the father. I can't remember the exact reference to that now, but there's this interesting sort of thing about in his poems, you have these images of windows. In his artwork, you have images of window, and then she's taking those images of windows. I think this is my last slide. thought I'd conclude with this because everybody always asks about this strange creature coming into the window or into the room from the window. It's really intriguing because what you see in these images is, yes, the poet looking out, and the poet is almost always less colorful than the actual images. Yes. It's a variation. This one's slightly different. The poet is not as defined, but it comes up throughout. And I thought this one really connects with those motifs of the window eye, the motif of memory, and the motif of refuge, self-preservation and refuge, in the sense that looking out of the window, the contents, the imagination is also coming into the room. So we have that pull between the present and future and the past, right? There's that sort of interesting pull. And then, fascinatingly, that figure is kind of in a painting, but he's stepping out of a painting, or she's stepping out of a painting. That painting did exist at some point. Joachim, his brother, did this painting of this creature and sold it, and nobody, like the person he sold it to, can't find it or something. So it's gone missing. And so she has this like haunting image of this painting that's gone missing, as if it's walked out of the world. And that too is interesting in terms of the way in which both Dieter Leisegang and Claire-Lise Holy take their own life as walking out of this world when they're no longer self-preserved, right? Or something, when their refuges are gone. If their refuge is art, they don't have that anymore. So that is my last slide. So
We have time for questions.
We do. We have time for questions. And I'd love to hear what you all think, and have seen. Many of you walked around and looked at stuff earlier, and just sort of love to hear your thoughts.
What would you say is her greatest contribution?
Her greatest contribution? To art, or to theater, or to...
Start with theater.
What is her greatest contribution to theater? That's such a hard question, Herb. I think that her greatest contribution are her designs. Like if you look at the book on the podium, larger book, there's these wonderful designs, and many of them are these sort of very elaborate costume designs, but also these very elaborate set designs. And I think that the contribution is they always seem to be connected to the authenticity that the writer was looking for. So that there is this sort of sense of, if you're working on Brecht, what were the aesthetics that Brecht did? He didn't write the script that she's working on, but like if it's a movie about his work, what are his aesthetics? How can I reproduce those aesthetics with it not being a copy, but with it being true to the sense of that? So like this idea of, I don't know, Beckett would say, content is form, form is content, right? That they have to connect to each other. So that's what I would say. Yeah.
So
Scott.
Just imagining Beckett on TV
Mm.
in the 70s or 80s. Wondering, where were these shown? Was it shown on primetime TV or their version of PBS? Do you know?
Yeah.
In the 70s, we're watching Matlock and
Yeah.
Fantasy Island.
So the Süddeutsche Rundfunk. So there's like the Süddeutsche Rundfunk. It's now the Südwestliche Rundfunk, I think. They had in all of these like German television in the 70s and 80s was had these really intriguing arts kinds of shows, experimentations. And so with Beckett, he was invited. They had this whole series. They were inviting writers contemporary writers to produce things. And they were these one-off sort of television plays. They were not aired during prime time. Beckett's were aired between, I think, like 10 p.m. and midnight or 1 a.m., right? But his works are also like all about ghosts and stuff. So the idea was, he's also thinking about, I know they're airing these at this time, so it's got to have this eerie feeling. It can't be like, I'm pretty sure that if it was during the day, Beckett would have done something different. I don't have the actual numbers, but years ago when I went to Stuttgart and looked at the materials, I saw that they had a lot of people tune in. There were like over 1 million people tuned into Beckett's works. So the percentage was not super high, but they were really ecstatic. They kept inviting him back up until like 84 or something because they were considered really successful arts projects, right? So they weren't looking for 20 million viewers. They were looking for less than 1 million, and they got more than they got. So, and the Hessische Rundfunk and ARD, like all these television studios, they're working with these arts projects. That was part of their artistic vision. So they did have their like Matlock during the day. I think it was called Tatort, but they also had these arts projects at night, and it was not PBS. They were different television stations, but
Do you think that is Bill Doom,
Uh-huh.
their art is also connected to the kind of profession they went throughout the first South and when it's the first world and the two world wars, the feeling of desperation?
Definitely. I don't necessarily think that all of the artists are aware of how the Second World War, particularly in the Holocaust, impacts them. We do know that Beckett is very much traumatized and haunted by images of the Holocaust. And so many Beckett History Memory Archive, that collection of essays that I co-edited and wrote an essay for, deals with how Beckett is, how history and trauma and memory come into the works despite whether or not it's intentional, right? Claire-Lise is born in 1938. She's a child of the Second World War, right? She's growing up in Switzerland, so she's a little bit removed, but there is this sense of that. And then Dieter Leisegang and the whole Leisegang family is living in Wiesbaden and Frankfurt and Offenbach during the war. And so there is a poem, and I think it's somewhere over there called, I don't remember the name. I'll have to show it to you, but in the middle of it is LK, 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 and then it's like the year of my birth. LK was the cellars where you would hide during the air raids, right? And Dieter is born in 1942, so he was actually saying, I was born during an air raid, right? And so very much this sense of that. And then, of course, in Germany, in the 70s and 80s, there's the whole history debates, because we all know that Germany doesn't admit to the Holocaust till later, till people are found who experienced the Holocaust and the atrocities, and that becomes sort of part of their national identity. But it doesn't happen immediately after the war, and so that definitely, and I mean, Dieter's mother helped hide Jews and was imprisoned for a couple days for it, and they all knew people who were affected by the Holocaust. Yeah. and the Second World War. So I do think that has a major impact of how that affects them. I don't know if they would say that's what affected me. I think that's how it becomes a sort of issue of trauma of like, that, yeah. That's a good point. Yeah.
In terms of making her visual art or drawings, are you aware of who she thought of as her artistic visual art influences? Because I look at them and I think there's a relationship with surrealists and then also like she would be thinking about Hopper, American artist, but the windows,
yeah.
the figure, and those reflections. I think she's actually talked to you or you're thought about what art she really at.
So she really liked the Swiss artist Valeton. She loved, I mean, it's interesting because it's also some works that Beckett loved, like the Dutch 17th century art, like who doesn't like that, but like going further back. But she did like Hopper. I do know that, because I want to say she sent me a postcard of Hopper before, but also somebody else like Lucy Jeffries, who reviewed Samuel Beckett in contemporary art, drew the connection with Hopper. There's something about the color, the vibrant colors, but they're not lively, right? You know, that there's something lonely behind them. And the surrealists, I know from her library, like going into her, looking at what books she had, she loved Picasso. And Dita Leisgang did as well. In fact, one of his little drawings is like Picasso reading Giacometti, right? So they're very much influenced by those writers, those artists. But yeah, and the surrealists in general, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I was looking at all of these pictures, and I was thinking what my audience person said about the Holocaust. And the thing I can see is the quality of softness. And I'm looking back at people who lived during that time. I don't think that ever leaves them.
Yeah.
And I can see in all of these paintings, I can see a quality that would come from that.
Yeah, I think that's apt. Yeah, I think that's right. All of these are supposedly take place in, the room is in a hotel in Basel. Not that you have to know that, I just know that because there's a photograph of Dita looking out of a window. And he also had tuberculosis, and he went to Switzerland for experimental operation where they cut out a piece of your lung so to try to cure tuberculosis. And so this is like, I think this is like with him waiting to go to the next place where he'd go get that treatment, which is also interesting as that solemnness is, if these are images at the end of her life where she's not well, where she's in Switzerland, and they lived in Montreux, which is very close to a lot of these famous places where they used to send tuberculosis victims because the clean air, right? So there's all these like clinics there. And so, so she's also in this same space. So I think that there's that solemnness from the history, but also from that sort of very personal moment. Yeah. I think it's your turn, Phyllis.
Well, I was going to ask about the window. But
Yeah.
The other thing, so you answered that question, but the other thing I was wondering is if you mentioned the postcard, the Hopper postcard, possibly, and so I'm wondering if there are journals or correspondence, and if so, how has that kind of informed you thinking back through these reflections?
So she did not keep any journals that I know of, you know, and her work has not been written on very frequently. And so I don't have that, I've gotten sort of bits and pieces. I do, her husband, Joachim Leisegang, has told me certain things, but yeah. And so it's piecing that together. But I also, I know that they knew E.T.A. Hoffmann's short story. We know it from the book Hoffmann on Fenster, but we also know because it's like standard reading in Germany. Like there isn't a German who hasn't read it, I would argue. Maybe now, but not then. So, and then you see that kind of juxtapositioning as well in German films of the 1920s and 30s, where it's like, that expressionist film. So there is this sort of history that she's bringing with her. Yeah. Anything else? No?
Well, another thank you for Dr. Weiss.